Okay, the readings for the memorial of Saint Augustine, Bishop and Doctor of the Church. The first reading is from 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17 to 25. So, a couple things stuck out for me just because this is the feast of Saint Augustine. So it's talking about how he sent him to preach. Paul was sent to preach the gospel, but not with the wisdom of human eloquence, so that the cross might not be emptied of its meaning. So meaning to not speak with such worldly wisdom or intelligence as to take away from the crucifixion, the power and beauty and divine wisdom of the crucifixion, which seems folly to worldly men. Worldly men think that power and fame and influence and health and strength are pretty much everything. And while all of these things are good in their own places, in their own proper places, they're nothing compared to the sacrificial act of God on the cross. And so all of these things pale in comparison. They're nothing compared to the cross. But if you're worldly, you'll seek all these other things and you'll miss God. You'll miss the divine wisdom of living a life of sacrifice and charity for others. And so there's this kind of conflict here, it looks like, going on in the first in this first reading, with Paul talking about, the difference between the wisdom of man and God. And so, let's see. He goes on to say towards the end, actually he says at one point he's questioning, where's the wise one? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Which that makes me think of Augustine because of his extreme intelligence. I'll talk about Augustine after this. But like I said, there's stuff that popped up because this is the Feast of St. Augustine. I really like St. Augustine. He's one of the first saints I read in my early formation, my teenage years of the faith, when I really started applying myself. And so I'll talk more about him after all the readings. But this reading here, he goes on to say, it was the will of God through the foolishness of the proclamation to save those who have faith. And so he's showing that faith is greater than intellect or physical strength. Faith is greater. It is a greater thing to believe the teachings of God than any other teachings. Like I said, all of these have their place, but faith first. Faith, God first, and then the intellect, and then the body. So it's soul, or it's spirit and soul lift up to God. And then our intellect also lifted up, and our body lifted up. So we use those things in union with and in second place to our faith. Faith must lead us. And so he goes on, for Jews demanded signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified. So once again, here when he says Greeks looking for wisdom, he's not talking about the spiritual gift of wisdom. He's talking about worldly wisdom, what Greeks thought to the height of their intellectual ability. That's what they treasured. And Jews wanted signs. Jews wanted displays of power and miracles. They wanted, so they wanted God to do things for them and impress them. And the Greeks wanted, this great intellect that they could grasp. And so this is why they both stumbled trying to find him, because it's Christ crucified. The Greeks wanted, a God to illuminate their minds and answer all their questions and be reasonable to them. The Jews wanted a God that would perform signs for them and miracles. And the problem with both the Jews and the Greeks is they wanted they wanted their false gods. They wanted God to be what they wanted him to be and did not accept him as he is, which is Christ crucified. And so it's so important to accept God as he is. And Christ crucified is the most difficult God to accept because it requires humility, obedience, and sacrifice. And so the path of Christ is the most challenging. but it is the most good and true. It's completely good and true. And so it's important to understand that. And how do we understand this? Here, let's go into the psalm. The psalm is Psalm 33, verse 1 to 2, 4 to 5, 10 to 11. The earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. And so, and it goes on to talking about praise of the Lord, and his works are trustworthy. He loves justice and right. The Lord brings, the last verse here, the Lord brings to naught the plans of nations. He foils the designs of people. But the plan of the Lord stands forever, the design of his heart through all generations. So God has created everything, and he's created everything good, and he's created man very good, but according to his divine plan. When we break from that, it becomes distorted. We stumble, as it speaks about the Jews and the Greeks here in the first reading. And so the earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. If we live the life that God has set out for us, and in this world that God has set up with its rules, with his commandments, then we see the wisdom of God. This is how we know the wisdom of God on the cross. Because if we live that life, if we practice it, it becomes very real and very clear to us. When you live outside of that, you're grasping at different things. Like I said, the Greeks went after worldly wisdom, the Jews wanted signs, and so you start distorting the true image of God, the face of God. You look for a God of your own making, and while you may have taken as a general idea God presented to you in Christianity, if you do not take him as he is, you start to make him something else. You start to change who God is, which you cannot do. That leads you astray, because now you're following yourself, but you're projecting yourself onto this idea of God. You're like, this is who God should be. This is what I want God to do for me, or he's not God. But then it's not God whom you're seeking, it's yourself. And it's a very, anyone can fall into this. It's a very dangerous thing. Like I said, that's why I will keep hitting this, because I see how important now these are. I've always known they were important, but throughout life now I see more and more. Humility and obedience. To follow God as he says, not as you want. And so it's going to be a struggle that you will have the rest of our lives, and you have to keep humbling yourself and practicing obedience and all the other virtues. And so the Alleluia verse is Luke chapter 21, verse 36. Be vigilant at all times and pray, that you may have the strength to stand before the Son of Man. So, this strength to stand before the Son of Man, like I said, wanting God to do things for you, or wanting to grasp God just by your intellect alone, will not give you the strength to stand before the Son of Man. It says right here, be vigilant at all times and pray. That prayer, that relationship with God, that time spent with God, he gives you grace. And that grace, his grace, is so you have the strength to stand before the Son of Man. The only way we can stand before God is by his grace. And we participate in that grace in prayer, and especially through the greatest prayer of all, the most powerful prayer, which is the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The holy sacrifice of the Mass makes Christ crucified present. This is the wisdom of God. Christ's crucifixion is made present at the Mass. And because of that, because of Christ's crucifixion, our sins are forgiven. And we are called to a greater nature than just our animal nature, and even our intellectual nature. We are called to a spiritual nature, to rise up so much higher. And when we do that, when we participate in the Mass, and we participate in the Mass also every day of our lives, every moment of our lives, what we do day to day in our body and in our mind, because we are also spirit, affects that. That's what we bring to Mass. We bring the merits, the things we have done with God's grace, the good in the world, to the Mass as an offering. And we also bring our sins, our failures and faults, because the cross of Christ is made present there. And so we offer those as well and say, please, God, purify me from these sins. And also here's the work I've done for you by your grace. You've given me this body, this mind, my soul, and this is what I've done with it. And, take these gifts and make them something greater than just my human efforts. And this is what happens at the Mass. It's so incredible. And so at the Mass, we are given this grace and this strength that we will need to be able to have the strength to stand before the Son of Man. And that was a long rant on the Alleluia verse. Anyway, the gospel is Matthew chapter 25, verse 1 to 13. This is the foolish virgins. So, what's interesting here is God chose virgins. It wasn't a tax collector. It wasn't scribes and Pharisees. It wasn't, workers in the vineyard. He chose virgins. And virginity is a gift that God has given. And it's meant to be given away to your spouse or to be given to God. And so he's taking these people who, that example of virginity, there's some virtue in them. There's some discipline in them at least, right? But it's not enough. It's not enough that you are disciplined. By your practice and your strength alone, you cannot enter in, because what happens is 5 of them are wise and 5 of them are foolish. So the foolish ones bring their lamps, but have no oil with them. And that oil, I believe, represents, that life of grace lived in God, in prayer and in good deeds done for God. That's that oil, so that our lamp may be lit in the darkness to welcome God, right? And so they take no oil with them, these foolish virgins. They're disciplined in some things, but they're not in others. They're disciplined in what they want to do, but not what they should do. And the wise ones, it says, brought flasks of oil for their lamps. And so the bridegroom was long to delay. They all became drowsy and fell asleep. So all of them fell asleep. It was, late at night. And so the sleeping at night, I mean, I don't know the full depth of this, but I mean, just relating it to my day-to-day life, when I fall asleep, it's so important throughout the day for me to pray, and in the evening as well, to have evening prayers, to have prayers when I wake up in the middle of the night. It's so important that I pray immediately upon waking, because this keeps me more focused on God than I would be on myself. If I don't pray at all, then I just focus on myself, and who knows where I'll go with that. I'll go the wrong way, because I'm relying on my strength or my intellect. Like in the first reading I'm too worldly or even too intellectual and not spiritual enough. And so I need God to direct me. I need God to be that oil for the lamp in the darkness, to light my way through this world. And so what happens is the ones that have oil, when it's cried out that the bridegroom is coming, the wise ones get up and they light their lamps and greet God. The ones that don't have oil, start asking the ones that have oil, can we have some? And they only have enough for themselves to light their lamps. And so they go off to try and acquire some at the last minute. So this is those, I think this shows those who follow their way instead of God's way. While their way might be based on God's way and may be, saying they're seeking God and may even be seeking God, but they're doing it their way. And so they don't have the oil they need for their lamps. Whereas the wise virgins are the ones who seek God his way. And that's why they have this reservoir of oil. And so they're ready to meet him when he comes. And the effects of this is that they go out and try to acquire some oil at the last second. And they can't. And so the ones who have their lamps lit greet him and go into the wedding feast, and they're joyful and with God. The other ones come, and the response here, they're crying out. The door's locked, so they're crying out, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he said in reply, Amen, I say to you, I do not know you. And so, like I said, and this is why one of the reasons I think that this oil represents our time in prayer and good deeds done for the Lord, our time spent with God, whether it be in good actions, whether it be in meditating on prayers and all these other things, our time spent with God. We get to know him and he knows us. In the Old Testament, that turn of phrase, at least as it's translated into the English, is it's said that a husband, when he would have intimacy with his wife, would know her. He knew her, right? And so this intimacy, this idea of intimacy, of knowing somebody. And so here with God in the spiritual sense, so beyond just physical intimacy, beyond just an intellectual intimacy, knowing of God, reading his history, listening to things he says, and knowing his ideals. There's that spiritual practice of actually spending time, of really knowing God. And so this intimacy is so important. And that's why prayer is so important. And that prayer should lead us, especially to the greatest prayer, Mass. Mass is so important. That's why we have to go every Sunday. It is a mortal sin to miss without good reason the Mass, because the Mass is that important. It's that intimacy we spend with God. And at least every Sunday, I say every day if you can, but at least every Sunday. And also prayer every day. That's also a much lesser form of the Mass, because the Mass is the greatest prayer, and you cannot do that on your own. It requires the community and the priest and the sacrament. It requires, there's so much going on at the Mass, but we can enter into that in our daily prayers, though, the time we spend with God. At Mass, there's a great intimacy there because God is present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Outside of the Mass, he's present, soul, and divinity. And so that's still important to spend those intimacies with God in prayer and meditation, and also in good deeds, where our whole being should be spending time with God. I'm sorry, I'm going on longer. I think you guys get the idea. But the point is, and it says, therefore stay awake. You know neither the day nor the hour. Therefore stay awake. I think it doesn't mean you have to stay awake all night. If you can pray through the night, great. I've heard there's a lot of saints stories I've heard where they spent most of the night in prayer and they were still able to function throughout the day because their supernatural life was so great that it perfected their human nature. They didn't need as much sleep. They didn't need as much food. They were living in the grace of God, and so their human nature was lifted up even in their daily lives. And if you can do that, great, do it. But this stay awake, I believe, means to not let your soul, your spirit fall asleep, to not let your heart become hardened, to lose that relationship with God. So stay awake, pray throughout the day, pray throughout your life. Keep awake that relationship with God, so that when he comes, he knows you and you know him, and you rush out to meet him and he rushes out to meet you, instead of being in the darkness. So when he comes, you don't even see him. Your lamp is not lit. Pray, spend time with God, because this is what we want. This is the end of all things. It is God, and you should rejoice in that. But if you don't have a relationship with God, or don't have a good relationship with God, you need to pray more and spend more time with him to realize how great God is. That to spend eternity with God will be a wonderful thing. But those who do not, follow God as he is are troubled by it, because they don't understand him, and they have a fear of the end because they don't know God. If you know God, you want to be with him, especially in the Mass. What happens at the Mass is so beautiful and so powerful and so profound and so beyond words, that here I am just throwing a bunch of words at it because it's beyond description. It must be practiced. Anyway, I'm rambling a lot here. Let me wrap up by talking about St. Augustine real quick. St. Augustine, great saint, bishop and doctor of the church. St. Augustine I came across when I was a teenager, and I read his Confessions, except for the last chapter. For some reason, I read all the way until I guess the last chapter. I'm like, I don't understand this at all. But a lot of the other stuff, I understood to some degree, but I was fascinated by it. What struck me most about St. Augustine, I'll just leave it at this. Read about St. Augustine, though. But what struck me about him was how much you could see he loved God in the way he wrote. In the Confessions, I was struck by how much this man was in love with God. I was like, what a striking example. And it's something I was like, I want that. I want to be like this. Because St. Augustine fell away from the faith. He didn't really, I guess, practice it much in his youth. And he fell away because of worldly pleasures, and a lot of them too. But he was always very passionate. And so God has made each one of us with different gifts and skills and abilities. And Augustine had a great mind, a great intellect, but also he was very passionate too. And so he was also very worldly. He had both of these things in abundance, but his spirit was weak, and so he fell away. But God brought him back after much searching for this. He was always searching. And once he finally found God, he applied himself magnificently, because now his passion was for God and not for his own pleasure or for things of the world. And his intellect now was for God and not for his own understanding and his own pride, which he had used it for before. And so this great intellect and this great passion were now directed towards God, as any of our gifts should be. God first. Our gifts should be put at the service of God. And so when he now went with his done, people stopped him and pretty much made him become a priest, because they saw the grace working in him, because the way he was living his life so virtuously. And they're like, no. And so at the time, this was they pretty much made him, and he accepted out of humility. And then he became bishop as well. And through this time, he wrote extremely well of our Lord, because he was so in love with him, and he had the mind to explain him in such a beautiful way that to this day, people speak of St. Augustine and read him. He is that important of a thinker. And so God lifted up his abilities he had given him to their proper place. And so it's beautiful to see the love that St. Augustine had for God in his words and in his actions and in his spirit. Like I said, read some of the Confessions, you'd be like, whoa, this guy really loves God. And and he was great fighting against all these different errors and heresies too of his day, where once again, people in the faith and even outside of the faith would take the faith and twist it, because they wanted to do it their own way. They wanted to twist it to their own interpretation, their own thoughts. And St. Augustine would put them straight. He would show, no, it's Christ crucified, and he would use his intellect and his passion, but he was spiritual first now, and so he became a great defender of the faith as well. And so may we use our gifts first and foremost for God, because that's what they were given to us for. That's how they are perfected. Our gifts become in their proper place when used for worship of God. It doesn't mean you have to go and be a priest or a bishop, but whatever you do well, do it for God. The work you do that as a prayer and as an offering to Christ, especially Christ crucified. When you find your work difficult, offer up those difficulties to God, and especially at the Mass. And he takes these and he brings greater fruit from them than we ever could of our own power. And and then to end with St. Augustine, my favorite line of his, and I pray at every Mass because of his love for God. I pray this because I'm trying to love God in something of the way he did. And it's, I'm forgetting it right now. How do I say it? It's a part of the prayer that, okay. O beauty, he's writing to God. O beauty ever ancient, O beauty ever new. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so I always say that during the consecration, at some point in the consecration, because God is truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity at the Eucharist. And like I said, different Eucharistic miracles, they've done tests when the host has actually become actual flesh. And one of the tests showed it was the heart wall. It physically became God's heart. So our hearts are restless until they rest in God's heart. And so this is a prayer I pray that St. Augustine would stir my passions and direct them towards God. And so that I have that love of God that he has. Like I said, read some of his confessions and you'll see. But it's a beautiful sentiment of St. Augustine. He understood the world. He understood its pleasures. He understood its intellectual praises. He understood pride and fame to a certain degree. Like he understood the fullness of the world, and it was nothing compared to God. And that's what comes across in that prayer so beautifully, because his heart was still restless. With everything, with all of his gifts and abilities and experiences that he had, his heart was still restless. And our hearts are too, and that's not a bad thing. Our hearts should be restless until they rest in perfection, which is God, which is the wedding feast we enter into with that, hopefully that lamp of ours lit by his grace that we participate in. And so our hearts are restless because we are supposed to be seeking God. We will always be restless in this world. And that's a gift from God, so that we don't become complacent and we fail to have that oil that we need when darkness surrounds us. We need to be restless in this life and in this journey so that we seek God, and he gives us the grace to stand before him and for all time. So those are my thoughts.